History is often measured in decades, but the fate of Western civilization was decided in exactly 7 minutes. On June 7, 1940, the world was screaming in chaos. Nazi panzers had just completed the sickle cut through the Ardennes, shattering the French army, the most powerful military force in the world, in just 6 weeks. London was bracing for an invasion, and the United States was looking at its own borders with terror. Inside the quiet, wood-paneled office of Chrysler headquarters in Highland Park, Michigan, a telephone rang. It was William Knudsen, a former Ford executive turned Roosevelt's commissioner of industrial production. On the other end was K.T. Keller, the blunt, cigar-chomping president of Chrysler. The conversation was devoid of pleasantries. Knudsen asked, "Keller, can Chrysler build tanks?" Keller's response was brutal and legendary, "I don't know. I've never even seen one of these things. But if the country needs them, we will build them the Detroit way." This wasn't just a business deal, it was a total pivot of the American consciousness. At that moment, the United States was a military ghost. It ranked 19th in global military power, sitting comfortably behind the tiny nation of Portugal. America possessed exactly 66 medium tanks. Most were obsolete iron coffins from the 1920s. Within 4 years, this single phone call would lead to a steel flood that would drown the Third Reich. This is the story of how a car company weaponized production itself. To understand why Chrysler's task was considered impossible, we must look at the archaic way tanks were built in 1940. Before the Detroit miracle, tanks were treated like high-end Swiss watches. At government facilities like the Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, production was governed by the Craftsman model. Each tank was a unique work of art. Skilled machinists would hand-file armor plates to fit specific hulls. If a transmission gear was a fraction of a millimeter off, a specialist would spend hours grinding it down to fit that one specific tank. There was no such thing as interchangeable parts. If a tank broke a track link in the field, you couldn't just swap it with another, you often had to wait for a custom machine replacement. Rock Island could produce, at absolute peak capacity, 3 medium tanks per month. Knudsen and Keller did the math. To fulfill the Army's immediate desperate need for 1,000 tanks, the Craftsman model would take 277 years. The Germans, meanwhile, were already deploying thousands of panzers using coordinated industrial tactics. Keller realized that to win, America had to kill the artist and birth the industrialist. He famously told his team, "We aren't making jewelry. We are making 30-ton Chevrolets. If a part doesn't fit on the first try, throw it in the scrap bin and get another one. Everything must be identical." Keller immediately formed what became known as the Tank Committee. This was an elite strike team of Chrysler's most brilliant production minds: B.E. Hutchinson, the financial and logistical genius; Owen Skelton, the master of manufacturing flow; and Harry Wilson, a man who viewed mechanical problems as personal insults. They realized they couldn't build tanks in a car factory, the weight would crush the floors. They needed a machine for making machines. They commissioned Albert Kahn, the 71-year-old architect who had designed the factories that made Henry Ford a billionaire. Kahn was a German-Jewish immigrant who understood exactly what was at stake in the fight against Nazism. Kahn designed the Detroit Arsenal tank plant in Warren, Michigan. It was a 1.25 million square foot monster, but its genius lay in the details. Kahn pioneered the sunken trench system. He realized that 40 of tank assembly time was wasted because workers had to lie on their backs or use heavy jacks to reach the suspension. Kahn built 4-foot-deep trenches directly into the assembly line. The tanks rode over these trenches, allowing workers to stand upright comfortably, installing gears and bogies with precision and speed. This design choice alone slashed the production time of a single tank by over 100 man-hours. The timeline was insane. Groundbreaking happened in September 1940. The Army demanded the first tank by April 1941. That meant building one of the world's largest factories and a 30-ton armored vehicle simultaneously during a brutal Michigan winter. By February, the factory was a skeletal frame of steel and concrete. There were no windows, no doors, and zero heating. The temperature inside was often 10 degrees below zero. The Tank Committee refused to stop. They pushed a massive steam locomotive into the unfinished building. Its boiler was used as a makeshift furnace, belching steam and heat into the immediate work area so that workers' hands wouldn't freeze to the steel plates they were bolting together. Men worked 18-hour shifts in heavy wool coats, their breath fogging up the air, assembling the first M3 medium tanks while snow literally fell through the unfinished roof onto the engines. This wasn't business, this was a religious devotion to production. On April 12, 1941, the first Chrysler tank, nicknamed the Easter Egg, roared to life. To prove its durability, Keller himself rode in the tank as it smashed through a mock-up farmhouse and crushed a series of obstacles before a crowd of stunned military officials. As the factory grew, a new crisis emerged: engines. Every high-performance engine in America was being diverted to the Air Force for B-17s and P-51s. The Army told Chrysler there were no engines for their tanks. Most companies would have quit. Chrysler's Harry Wilson went to the basement. He took 5 existing Chrysler 6-cylinder car engines, the same ones used in everyday civilian sedans, and arranged them in a circular multibank pattern around a central gear case. The result was the A57 multibank, a 30-cylinder, 425-horsepower beast. The military brass hated it. They called it a Rube Goldberg death trap. It had 5 of everything: 5 carburetors, 5 water pumps, and 5 spark plug sets. But Wilson's logic was flawless. We already have the tools to make these engines by the millions. We don't need a new factory, we just need a new way to connect them. The A57 became one of the most reliable engines of the war. If one of the 5 engines was shot out in battle, the tank could still limp home on the remaining 4. It was a masterpiece of spare parts engineering that only Detroit could have conceived. In 1940, all tanks were riveted together. It was the safe way. But Chrysler's engineers discovered a terrifying reality in ballistic testing: when a non-penetrating shell hit a riveted tank, the shockwave would snap the rivets off inside the cabin. These rivets became high-velocity shrapnel, bouncing around the inside of the tank and killing the crew even if the enemy shell never broke the armor. Chrysler fought the Army Ordnance Department to allow all welded hulls. The Army resisted, claiming welding was too slow and required too much skill. Chrysler responded by building welding jigs, massive rotating cradles that could hold a 15-ton hull and flip it like a piece of meat on a grill. This allowed workers to always weld in a downhand position, which is faster and stronger. They hired thousands of people who had never seen a welding torch: farmers, shopkeepers, and women, and put them through a 14-day blitz school. These workers became the most elite welding force in the world. By 1942, Chrysler's welded tanks were not only safer but could be produced 10 times faster than the riveted versions used by the British and the Germans. By late 1942, the Detroit Arsenal reached a state of industrial nirvana. The factory ran on 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The noise inside was a deafening symphony of pneumatic drills, massive overhead cranes, and the roar of engines. Owen Skelton's production expediters patrolled the miles of assembly lines on bicycles. If a drill bit broke or a supplier was 5 minutes late, these engineers were there in seconds to fix the bottleneck. The goal was the 55-minute mark. Every 55 minutes, a siren blared, and a brand new M4 Sherman rolled off the end of the line, gassed up, and driven straight onto a train car destined for New York or San Francisco. In December 1942, the plant produced 896 tanks. Let's look at the brutal math of that number. Nazi Germany, with all its occupied territories and slave labor, was struggling to produce 400 to 500 tanks per month nationwide. Chrysler, in one single building in Michigan, was outproducing the entire Third Reich by nearly double. Hitler believed American democracy was soft and unorganized. December 1942 proved that a free-market car company, when mobilized, was the most terrifying weapon ever created. A common myth is that the Sherman was a death trap because the German Tiger was more powerful. It's true, a Tiger had a bigger gun and thicker armor. In a one-on-one duel, the Tiger usually won. But Chrysler's engineers weren't designing a dueling pistol, they were designing a war-winning system. The Sherman was designed for standardization. Shipping, it was exactly wide enough to fit on a standard U.S. rail car and light enough to be lifted by a standard ship's crane. Tigers were so heavy they often broke the bridges they tried to cross. Reliability, a Sherman could drive 1,000 miles before needing a major overhaul. A Tiger often broke down after 60 miles. Repairability, because of Chrysler's interchangeable parts philosophy, a mechanic could strip a transmission from a destroyed Sherman and bolt it into a working one in 3 hours. For a German Panther, that same repair took 3 days and required a factory technician. Chrysler's logic was cold: we will build 50,000 good tanks while they build 1,300 perfect ones. Our numbers will eventually erase their quality. And that is exactly what happened. The Detroit Arsenal was the heart, but the veins stretched across the entire continent. B.E. Hutchinson managed a logistical web of over 400 primary suppliers and thousands of subcontractors. Foundries in Pennsylvania cast the massive final drive housings. Small machine shops in Wisconsin made the track pins. Rubber factories in Ohio made the tank treads. Chrysler sent technical assistance teams to every one of these small businesses. They taught a small shop that used to make lawnmowers how to achieve automotive precision. This created a national industrial dialect. By 1943, the entire American economy was synchronized to the 55-minute pulse of the Warren assembly line. This was the first time in history that a private company had essentially become a second branch of the government's military force. The tanks rolling out of Detroit didn't just carry American crews. Under the Lend-Lease Act, the Sherman became the universal soldier of the Allied cause. The British, they modified the Sherman with their own 17-pounder gun to create the Firefly, the only Allied tank the German Tiger commanders truly feared. The Soviets, while they loved their own T-34s, Soviet crews often preferred the Sherman for its comfort, its high-quality radios, and its unbreakable Chrysler engines. The Marines, in the Pacific, the Sherman was an unstoppable bunker buster, crushing Japanese defenses that had held for years. By 1944, Detroit Steel was fighting on every continent simultaneously. It was the ultimate proof that the American way of life could be weaponized to defend the world. By the time the war ended in 1945, the Detroit Arsenal had produced 22,234 tanks. But the miracle didn't stop there. The facility became the blueprint for the Cold War military-industrial complex. It went on to produce the M47, M48, and M60 Patton tanks that stood guard at the Berlin Wall for decades. Eventually, in 1982, Chrysler sold its defense division to General Dynamics for $336 million to save itself from bankruptcy. But the lesson remained: engineering courage. The Chrysler tank miracle happened because a few men refused to accept military tradition. They saw no difference between a luxury car and a killing machine. Both were systems that could be optimized, scaled, and perfected. The Detroit Arsenal proved that in the 20th century, the ultimate weapon wasn't a bigger gun, it was the assembly line. It was the triumph of the car guy over the general. As the war entered 1943 and 1944, Chrysler realized that the standard Sherman needed to evolve to face the increasing lethality of German anti-tank technology. This section of the war was an arms race fought in the blueprints of Detroit. The Firefly and the 76mm upgrade, the original 75mm gun, was an excellent high-explosive weapon for supporting infantry, but it struggled against the thick frontal armor of the German Panther. Chrysler's engineers worked feverishly to outgun the Sherman. They helped develop the M4A3E8, known as the EZ8. This version featured the horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, which gave the 30-ton beast a smoother ride and allowed it to fire more accurately on the move. Specialized monsters, Detroit didn't just build tanks, they built problem solvers. For the invasion of Normandy, Chrysler's production lines had to adapt to create Hobart's funnies. These included the Crab, a tank with a massive rotating flail on the front to explode landmines, and the Croc, a flamethrower tank. The Zippo legacy: while German tanks were often terrifying, they were rare. The Sherman was everywhere. This total presence meant that for every obstacle the Nazis built, Detroit manufactured a specific mechanical solution to tear it down. June 6, 1944, was the ultimate test for the Detroit Arsenal. On D-Day, thousands of Shermans were winched off ships and driven onto the blood-soaked sands of France. But the real story began after the beaches were won. The hedge-cutter innovation: in the bocage, the thick hedgerows of Normandy, the Sherman faced a nightmare. They couldn't drive over the thick, ancient hedges without exposing their weak underbellies to German rockets. Within days, an American sergeant named Curtis Cullen used scrap metal from German beach obstacles to create tusks for the front of the tank. Industrial adaptation: when the news reached Detroit, Chrysler didn't wait for a government contract. They immediately looked at how to integrate these rhino attachments into the production flow. This was the beauty of the Chrysler system: the distance between a soldier's problem in France and an engineer's solution in Michigan was shorter than in any other country in the world. The race to Paris: once the breakout occurred, the Sherman's reliability became the Allies' greatest weapon. German panzers were faster and stronger, but they broke down after long marches. The Chrysler-powered Shermans, however, raced across France at 25 miles per hour, day and night, rarely stopping for anything other than fuel. In December 1944, Hitler launched his final gamble in the Ardennes forest. He sent his massive King Tiger tanks, nearly 70 tons of steel, to crush the Allied lines. This was the moment the masterpiece met the mass-produced. The logistic nightmare for Germany: the King Tigers were so heavy they ran out of fuel in days. Many were abandoned because a single mechanical part broke and there was no replacement. The resilience of Detroit, in contrast: despite the freezing weather and being surrounded at Bastogne, the American crews kept their Shermans running. Why? Because Chrysler had designed the engines to be simple. A soldier could fix a Sherman with a wrench and a manual, a German needed a factory crane. The breaking point: by the time the skies cleared and Allied airpower returned, the German tank divisions were piles of abandoned, high-priced scrap metal. The Sherman, despite its average stats, had survived the winter because it was built for the grind of a long war, not the glory of a single duel. As the Allies crossed the Rhine into Germany, the Detroit Arsenal was still hitting record numbers. By 1945, the psychological effect on the German soldier was profound. German tankers reported that they would destroy one Sherman, only to see 3 more crest the hill minutes later. The steel wall, this was the victory of the proletariat in an industrial sense. The American worker had simply outworked the German soldier. The sheer volume of steel rolling out of Warren, Michigan, made German resistance mathematically impossible. Total war realized, at this stage, the Detroit Arsenal was producing more than just tanks, it was producing the certainty of victory. The workers in Michigan knew that Berlin was falling not just because of the bravery of the troops, but because they had weaponized time itself. The war ended in August 1945, but the world had been forever changed by what happened in those cornfields north of Detroit. The New World Order, the Chrysler tank miracle, created a blueprint for the military-industrial complex. It proved that a nation's true power isn't its standing army, but its industrial potential. A lesson for today: the story of the Detroit Arsenal is a story of what happens when a country stops arguing and starts building. It's a story of engineering courage, the idea that no problem is too big if you have enough steel, enough sparks, and enough will. The final honor: today, a historical marker stands at the site of the old arsenal. It notes that this facility produced more tanks than any other place on Earth. It is a monument to the car guys who saved the world. The victory of 1945 wasn't just won on the battlefields of Europe or the islands of the Pacific. It was won in the freezing winters of Michigan, by men and women who treated every bolt and every weld like a bullet aimed at tyranny. These tanks were the iron fist of democracy, and they were forged by the hands of everyday citizens who refused to lose. If you believe that history's most important battles are often fought in the factories and the design rooms, then you belong here. This is WW2 Impact. We don't just tell you who won, we tell you how they won. Don't miss our next deep dive into the machines that changed the world. Subscribe to the channel right now. Like this video to honor the men and women of the Detroit Arsenal. Comment below: if you were a tank commander in 1944, would you take the quality of a Tiger or the quantity of a Sherman? Stay sharp. Stay informed. Join the impact. Subscribe now.